Well, I must say I'm looking very handsome in this picture. But wait a second, this video is not about me. This video is about you! You're here because you want to know how to solve the first algorithm on Hackerrank.com. Well, don't worry, I have the answer for you. But, as most good developers know, before we solve the problem, we must define the problem. Fortunately, we live in a world where people are excellent at defining problems, saying, oh, this is the problem, I have this issue. That includes you, Hackerrank. Now, in all seriousness, Hackerrank really does define this problem well. So what are we doing? We're getting this basic array. Now remember, what is an array? An array is basically a type of data structure. Don't worry if you don't know the specifics of what data structure means. It's just basically a way of structuring data like strings or numbers. But basically we have this array and it's like a list of numbers. So what do we have to do with this array? Well, we have to take each number in the array and add it together. Then, after we've added all of the numbers together, we want to store that in some type of variable, and we want to return that result, or in other words, we want to access that result. I hope you're still with me, people! Before I just give you the solution, I want to get you thinking about the problem, because as I learned when I went through the free code camp exercises, just listening to somebody on YouTube tell you the answers, it's not going to help you improve. What you've got to do is you've got to think about it yourself, and then if you still can't figure it out, then you can watch the instructor's video. But then after you watch this video, what I recommend you do is you go back and you try to solve the problem again. And you might have to do this several times, but it's worth it because you will kind of internalize the lessons that you are intended to learn. We are now more than 2 minutes into the video, and we haven't started coding yet. Let's finally begin! Now, I'm going to solve this problem using JavaScript and syntax from the JavaScript language. While the specific syntax will vary from language to language, just watching this video will likely give you some ideas into how you could solve it in other languages as well. So, hopefully you can see everything on my cool monkey whiteboard. Listen, what we've got here is we've got an array, right? This is what's being supplied to us. So we have this array, and we know it's an array because there's square brackets. If these were kind of curly brackets, we would know that this is maybe an object or something else. If you're not familiar with objects, that's not important right now. The point is, we have these square brackets, so we know it's an array. And inside of our array, we've got these different numbers. So we've got 1, 5, 10, and 20. Now, our job is to add all of these numbers together. So what we want to do is we need to write some kind of code that basically goes through the following process. It's going to say, okay, this is what's being supplied to us. And now, what is 1 plus 5? Well, 1 plus 5 is 6. Now, what is 6 plus 10? Well, that's 16. Now, what is 16 plus 20? Oh, that's 36. And we also need to make sure that after we get that final result, that we save that result so that it doesn't disappear into the ether and we can actually use it. So, now, on my second monkey board, the second of which does not even have a frame. It got damaged, and I didn't have money to buy a new one, but that is not of the utmost importance at this moment. Now you'll see that we have a blank canvas. What does the programmer say? We have a blank function, and here's what we're going to do. Now, let's go back to this array that we had before. Remember that we're trying to add all of these numbers together, but we don't necessarily know how many numbers there are going to be. Think about it. If this array, for example, this array was a table, and we're putting all these bills on our table, we don't know how many bills there are going to be. So inside of our function, we need to use something called a loop. Now, hopefully you've learned about loops by this point. Loops are something that allow you to take some kind of repetitive action over and over and over again. Now, the type of loop that I'm the most comfortable with, and I think one that's very suitable in this situation, is the for loop. Now, there are three parts of a for loop. We have part one, which is setting the initial value. We have part two, which is setting a condition in which the loop will either run or not run, or continue running or finish running. And we have part three, and in part three, we create some kind of action that will lead us to part two. But let's talk about part one first in more detail. So in part one, we have the let declaration, variable declaration keyword. We have let I equal 0. Now, does this have to be I? No, this is I by convention, so it's recommended that you use I because other developers will understand, and you'll also easily understand other developer code. Developers. But this could be any letter. This could be B, this could be C, this could be Apple. It doesn't really matter. But conventionally, we're going to say let I equal 0. And this is, we're setting the initial value of our loop. Let's talk about part two of our for loop. Now remember, in part one, we set that initial variable. We said let I equal 0. After you finish the first part of the for loop, or after you finish the first statement, we need to add a semicolon. Now what this semicolon does is it separates the two statements. So now JavaScript knows that we're no longer talking about setting the initial value. So this part we've now finished for now. So now we're looking at part two. And in part two, what we're doing is we're going to create a condition. And typically we're going to use less than or greater than, or less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to, or equal to set this condition. And what will happen is that, for example, if our loop's intended purpose is to say hello, 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 our loop will continue to say hello as long as this condition is true. But as soon as this condition stops being true, then our loop will stop doing whatever we told it to do. So in this example, it would stop saying hello. Now, I want you to think, what would happen if we stopped here? If we did not go to part three of the for loop, if we stopped here, what would happen? We have our I equal to 0, and then we say as long as I is less than 10, that we will continue to say hello. Well, what would happen? Well, we would just say hello, 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 and the helloing would never stop. And that's because we haven't gone to part three. Now, in the last example, I told you that what if we had this loop, and then we logged hi to the console. Well, actually, in addition to just being redundant, saying hi, 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 and it never stopping, well, think about what will happen if the action never stops. It's very likely that your browser will crash, or whatever program you're running will crash. That's called an infinite loop, and that's something we want to try to avoid. So what we're going to do in part three of our for loop is we need to create some kind of action, right, that will allow us to move towards the direction in which eventually this condition will not be true. So what we're normally going to do here is we're going to either add 1 to our loop, or we're going to minus 1 from our loop, from our variable, rather. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say I, and then, remember the semicolon between part 1 and part 2, and then I'm going to say I plus plus. Now, what is this plus plus business? I don't know about you, but when I was in algebra, they didn't teach me this plus plus business. Plus plus is kind of like a way of writing JavaScript in a shorthand way. So I plus plus is the same thing as I equals I plus 1. So we're just taking whatever the current value of our variable is, and we're adding 1 to it. Do you see how this is powerful, though? So we have I, it's at 0, and then we have I is less than 10. And then we say we're going to increase I by 1, so now I is 1. And now we're going to run through the loop again. and then I will be 2, and then I will be 3, and then eventually, given that we've added this action taker, this action maker, eventually this condition will no longer be true, and then we will break out of the loop, and then we won't get stuck in the infinity loop. Whoa! Oh, I'm noisy. It's 12:45 a.m. I want to get kicked out by the landlord, and I'm going to be homeless in Vietnam. Now let's come full circle. Now that you've got some background knowledge, this problem will be very, very easy to solve. So, we've got our empty function. I said our function is function simple sum. And our function takes in a parameter, and that parameter will be some kind of array. Now, let's remember that this problem is giving us some kind of array. And our job is we're going to add all these numbers, right? So we don't know how many numbers there are going to be, but we know that we have to add all of them. So let's think about this logically. What we need is we need to have a total, and then for however many numbers there are, we need to add all of these numbers to the total. As I'm sure you could have guessed by now, that means we're going to use a for loop. So now on my board, you'll see that I have a for loop. And what you'll notice is that we haven't finished it yet. So this is the part that's kind of tricky. So we say, okay, so we're going to set I to 0, but then we need to think of some kind of condition here. Now, what kind of condition do we not want, right? We can't say we want to add some numbers as long as I is less than 10, right? Because we don't know how many numbers there are going to be. Fortunately, JavaScript gives us a little bit of flexibility in this regard, because what we do have is we know that this function is going to get passed an array as an argument, meaning we know that we're going to have something to work with, right? They're going to give us that array that we talked about earlier. So what we can say here is we can say whatever the array is, ARR, take how many items are in that array. So we can say ARR dot length. So dot length is a method that we can use to see how many characters are in a string or an array. So what we can do here is we can say, as long as I is less than the length of our array, we'll continue. And what should we then increase, or what action should we take here? We should increase I by 1, because that means we've done the first item, we've done the second item, we've done the third item, and then when we get to the 5th item, or however many items there are in the array, after having done this the proper amount of times, we'll then finish. We are on the closing stretch. So if you're feeling tired, if you're like, oh, dude, this programming stuff, I don't know if it's for me. You can do it! Here we go! Let's go! We're on the closing stretch. So what do we have to do here? Okay, so we have our for loop, but the problem is that our for loop does not have any logic. We have these conditions for how long it will run, but we don't have a logic inside. Remember before our logic was we're going to say hello, 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 hello. But now we don't want to say hello. Now we want to add those numbers that we were getting in the array. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing that's very important is we need to have somewhere to store all of this information, right? It's no good if we do all these actions and then at the end we don't have that information that we've retrieved stored somewhere. So before our for loop, what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable. And I'm going to say that variable is going to be called result. And you could call this whatever you want. You could call it sum. Result, that's just what I'm choosing. It's arbitrary. Just choose something that result or sum or something that would make sense to other developers. But what we're going to do is I'm going to say let result equal 0. And I've written let result equal 0, and I've written that above my for loop. Now, let's put the logic in the for loop so that we use some kind of logic to get to our result, and we put information in our result, the number that we need. So what we want is, in this array, we want to take the first value in the array, and we want to add that to our total. And then we want to go to the second value, and then the third value. Well, we've already written the logic to say, go to the first value, go to the second value, go to the third value. That's what we did in our for loop up here. But now we need the logic that says we're going to actually, instead of just going to these numbers and just printing them to the console, for example, what we want to do is we want to add them. So here's what we can do. We can say, let our result, and we can say plus equals. Now, plus equals is the same as just let result equal result plus blah, blah, blah. This is just shorthand. This let result plus equal is the same as let result equal result plus blah, 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 blah. They're both the same. You can write whichever way is more comfortable for you. But I'm going to recommend you stick with the first way because it will save you a lot of keystrokes, a lot of typing. And that's how other people are usually going to write it. So we have our result, and we say let result plus equal. Well, what do we want it to plus equal? We want it to equal, we want it to add this value of the array to our total, and then we want to add this value. But it's very important to remember that computers, I don't know who thought of this system, but for some reason computers do not count like humans. Computers do not say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Computers start counting with their own system, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So maybe that's because of something from the binary system. I don't know. But the point is, this is not the first value, actually. This is actually the 0th value. This is the first value, and this is the second value. So if we want to access this property of the array, this value in the array, here's the actual code that we would write. So we have our result, and what we are going to write is we're going to say add the number from the array, but we don't want to say add the array to our total. That doesn't make any sense. What we want is we want the specific value. We want this first value, or as JavaScript would say that this is value number 0, this is value number 1, this is value number 2. So how are we going to do that? We're going to say plus equal array, and we're going to use something called bracket notation. Bracket notation is just a way of accessing a specific value from within the array. So if we say plus equals array 0, well, that's great. What we're doing is we're going to say let our result plus equal this. Add 1 to our result. And then, wait a second. What would happen is it would say add 1 to our result. So our result is 1. And then add 1 to our result, and our result is 2, and add 1 to our result, and our result is 3. Because it's going to go through our loop 3 times, because that is the length of our loop. That is the length of our array. But we don't want it to just add 1 every time. So what you have to understand is that right here, where we're doing bracket notation, we cannot hard code this in. We actually have to use some kind of value where we want to say, first we want to access the 0th value of the array, then we want to access the first value of the array, then we want to access the second value. Well, where could we get some kind of variable that starts at 0 and is going to go up by 1 with every iteration of the array? Oh wait, we have already defined that. So we can say let result and add I to our result, or let array I and add that to our result. So what we have is we're going to start our for loop, blah, 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 and then we go here and we say result plus equals array I. So result plus equals 1, because at this time I is actually equal to 0. But then we're going to go through the array again. But remember, we said I is going to increment. I is going to go up by 1, so now I is 1. And then we'll add array I, which would be the second value. And then our result is now 3. So, oh, sorry, that is a 5. Our result is now 6. So then we're going to go through our for loop one more time. And now I is now number 2. So now we're going to say result, which is 6 at this point. And we're going to add result plus equals. And we're going to say, what is array 2? What is at the second position of the array? Well, at the second position of the array is 10. So that is how we would use a for loop to solve this initial algorithm. Now, the one thing we have to remember is that despite having done all of the necessary logic, we have not actually yet saved the logic. So how do we do that? After we finish our for loop, we've added all the numbers together, we will exit the for loop because this condition is no longer true. Then what we have to do is we need to make sure that before so what's going to happen is we're going to exit the for loop and then we're going to exit the function. But if we exit the function without remembering to save our result, we'll lose that result. So what we have to do is, after our for loop has finished, but before our function has finished, we need to add something called a return statement. And the return statement basically just says, save this value, and then you can go do something with that value. So what we're just going to say is we're going to say return result. So after you return your result, what happens is anytime we've got return, then it's going to exit the function, or it's going to exit that loop or that part. So we have return, we get our result, and then we are finished. You know, as much as I love the monkey boards, clearly I'm lacking in resources here a little bit. But regardless, I hope you found this video useful. I wanted to make this as beginner-friendly as possible. And that's why, despite being one of the most basic algorithms you could come across, we went into over 20 minutes of instruction to help you understand. If there's anything that was unclear, you can either comment below and I'll try to clear things up for you, or on GitHub, I've actually posted the solution to this problem so you can view my full code sample on GitHub. And again, remember that this is the Daily Developer Show. We do this every single day. Sometimes it's tutorials like this. Sometimes we're just talking shop about dev stuff. So I hope you found this video useful. My name is Cameron Tradukian. This is the Daily Developer Show, the show where we talk every single day about web development, software development, you name it, and how to optimize your lifestyle as a web developer or software developer. Please subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow.